Before we begin or go further, the staff and I would like to make this acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor the land upon which we gather today as the ancestral territory of the Lenni-Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania still continues. We take this moment to recognize the original stewards of this land and the histories of violence and erasure that have brought us here today. So for those of you who are back for a third time or a second time, my introduction may feel repetitive, but for those who are new to our event, I think it's really important for them to have context. So bear with me, everybody. For those not familiar, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage is a multidisciplinary grant maker in the 5-county Philadelphia region. We make grants in 2 areas primarily. We make project grants in performance and exhibitions and public interpretation, broadly conceived. And we also have a longstanding individual artist fellowships program. We invest about $10 million a year in culture in this city, in artists and projects that are of distinction, or of diversity and of substance. And the work is really about both foregrounding our community and raising the visibility of our city as a hub for dynamic cultural experiences. But as some of you may also know, in addition to our primary work, which is grants making, the center also functions as a hub for critical discourse around issues that are critical to arts practice. This work represents an effort on our part to connect our community to their peers nationally and around the world. And we hope it also makes a contribution to the fields that we serve that go beyond our grant dollars. So to that end, we produce publications with new scholarship. We present lectures, symposias, organize many different kinds of convenings, all of which explore relevant topics of the moment. And as part of that work, we have a visiting artist and scholars program for which we invite a distinguished practitioner to be in residence with us over a protracted period and to focus through a variety of activities that they design and conceive on an issue of particular urgency. And I'm reminded by our comm staff that at this point, I should say that if you are interested in finding out more information about the center and our events, please subscribe to our newsletter. We're going to put that link in the chat for those of you who are interested. So in 2021, the focus of our Visiting Scholars program is on Black cultural production. And we have been so delighted to have been pursuing this work with our visiting scholar for 2021 and today's moderator, Linda Earle. Linda has worked in the arts as an educator, administrator, funder, and curator, and as an advocate for inclusion, freedom of expression, and development of new platforms for cultural practice, participation, and discourse. Linda is a professor of practice in fine arts management and the associate graduate director for the Arts Management MA at Tyler School of Art, Temple University. Before joining Tyler's faculty, Linda served as executive director of the Great Lakes Colleges Association's New York Arts Program, which was an academic and professional development semester for undergraduates. She was director of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture from 1999 to 2009, and a senior program director at the New York State Council on the Arts, where the Individual Artist Program was founded under her leadership. Linda has taught film and cultural studies at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers, at Hunter College, at Barnard, and has served on numerous grants and commissioning panels and artist advocacy groups. She's also served on the College Art Association's Awards Committee for Distinction and Diversity and on the boards of arts and service organizations in many places. As a writer, she's held residencies at Hedgebrook and the Writers' Room and has collaborated in several creative and curatorial projects over the years, including this one with us. So Linda, it's been a great month, this month of April, with your webinars, and it's bittersweet to have the third one at the end of the month. the work will go on. And in any case, I want to, thank you and turn the day over to you and Rue. And we really look forward to today's event. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Rue, for being here. And thank you to the staff of the Pew Center. It's been a wonderful month. And I'm going to introduce Rue in a moment, but since it is the last day of National Poetry Day, I'm going to share our screen here for a moment and show you the catalog, the source book we'll be talking about. And since it is the last day of National Poetry Month, it feels particularly appropriate to start our conversation off today with just a line or two of a poem that serves as the epigraph for this publication. It's by Audre Lorde, and it's called "Who Said It Was Simple? Ain't That the Truth?" And just a line or two, a relevant line or two. But I, who am bound by my mirror as well by my bed, see causes in color as well as sex. And I sit here wondering which me will survive all these liberations. So we'll be talking about an exhibition and a curatorial effort that not only addressed the gaps in the art historical record, but also looked at the role of Black women artists in the history of arts activism, in the Black Power movement, and their role in first wave feminism and the feminisms that followed. Most importantly, it looked at the intersectional dynamics and frictions among all of those liberations. It was curated by Catherine Morris and our guest today, Rujeko Hockley. The show opened in 2017 at the Brooklyn Museum, and it really was a revelation. This publication, the source book, has since become an indispensable guide and a document of an approach to archival research. It was both expansive and quite nuanced, and it's brought new awareness of the artists and collectives at the nexus of the movement, and has generated new scholarship, critique, and inquiry. Rue is currently assistant curator for contemporary art at the Whitney Museum, where she co-curated the current Julie Meretu exhibition, which is another landmark show. Before the Brooklyn Museum, she worked as a curatorial assistant at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She's organized exhibitions and programs at various independent spaces, and she writes very beautifully about contemporary art with particular focus on conceptual practice, social practice, science fiction, social movements, and the African diaspora. She's also a fellow board member of mine at Art Matters Foundation. So it's a particular pleasure to talk to her about her work today. Ruth, thank you again and again for being here. I'm so excited to talk to you about We Wanted a Revolution. So I'm going to pass it over to you and ask you to talk about the process of the show. And we'll have a conversation after that, but we want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A from our audience and from the Pew Center staff. And so take it away. Rue.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this, Linda. One of my greatest achievements and joys in my career is being on the board of Art Matters. So because of the work that has been done there and the legacy of that organization and of all of you amazing people, that is ongoing. So let's just start with that. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
And thank you, Pew, to all of you all for having me and for organizing this great program and for inviting Linda to be in residence. Great decision. So I am going to share a screen so that we can start our presentation. Now, let's see. Slideshow. Can you see that, Linda? Yeah. Okay, great. So this is kind of just a short presentation on a very large and ever expanding exhibition and catalog that actually then became two catalogs and traveling show. And but I wanted to just give a sense of what the show looked like a little bit, and of what kind of work was included, and the way we thought about the archive very specifically, both in relation to the installation as well as the catalog. So this was the title wall, or actually this was the ending of the exhibition. So you would come through the whole show at the Brooklyn Museum, and then this was kind of the last thing that you saw. And it was reproduced in all of the different venues and different spaces. But I wanted to start here because in some ways this is where this exhibition started for me, with the Combahee River Collective. This quote, which I'm going to read because you're a captive audience. We believe that the most profound and potentially the most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. In the case of Black women, this is a particularly repugnant, dangerous, threatening, and therefore revolutionary concept, because it is obvious from looking at all the political movements that have preceded us that anyone is considered more worthy of liberation than ourselves. We reject pedestals, queenhood, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, lovely human, is enough. And for obvious reasons, I love that quote. The Combahee River Collective is a collective that was founded in Boston in the 1970s by Black lesbians, people like Barbara T. Smith and her sister, as well as kind of many other people that you would think of. Shalane McRae, actually the First Lady of New York City, was a member of the Combahee River Collective. And they have kind of many interesting writings. They kind of organize protests. They organize different kinds of mutual aid efforts in the city of Boston. And, you know, continued the legacy of many earlier organizations and precursors to many things that have continued. But this quote, I think so much of what we wanted to do in this show, which was really about the kind of between a rock and a hard place, both metaphorically and literally, that I think sometimes Black women have found themselves in political movements as well as just in society. You know, people, for example, people say Black men and women of color. And that phrase we hear often. It gets repeated in wall texts. For example, to this day, I've had this conversation at the Whitney. Where do Black women fall within that? And so I think this idea of being between the Black Power movement, which was kind of male dominated, and the mainstream feminist movement, which was dominated by white women and of a certain class and a certain background, where do Black women who believe in, yes, rejecting pedestals, queenhood, walking 10 paces behind, not walking 10 paces behind, where do they fit into it? And where do you fit if the language of the kind of common parlance of these ideas, rejecting pedestals, queenhood, the inherent humanity of all people, which includes women or femme-identified people, and you don't embrace the language of feminism or the label of feminism, where do you fit? And I think the answer that we came up with was like, it's actually not that complicated. And the people who were kind of advancing these ideas, these artists, didn't find it to be so complicated, but it was perceived externally as like a great tension. And so we were really interested in thinking through some of these things. The way the show came about, I worked at the Brooklyn Museum. I started there in 2012. Something like that. Started there in December 2012, and worked on many great shows. You know, enjoyed being there greatly. Prior to that, I'd been in graduate school at the University of California in San Diego, and in a PhD program where, like many of us in the art world, you know, I'm ABD. Well, maybe forever, we don't know. Never say never. But my qualifying exams and my kind of dissertation in incipient dissertation that I was potentially planning to complete, and maybe still, let's be hopeful, was thinking through kind of questions of how do you bring a conversation, a Black feminist theory, into art history, and how do you use that as a praxis to talk about Black artists, especially who are working in kind of conceptual practices. And I started with I was thinking about David Hammonds, I was thinking about Charles Gaines, and I was thinking about Senga Ngugi. And at a certain point, I realized, wow, they all were born basically the same year, 44, 45, 46. but they've had very different careers. And especially at this time, I started graduate school in 2009. They've had very different careers. They've had very different trajectories. The work that they're making now, the relationship to like new work and like changing their work is very different. And like one of these things is not like the other. And one that thing was that Senga was a woman. And when thinking about Senga's life and thinking about the trajectory she had been on and the path that she had been on versus the path that her male peers, all of whom, especially her and Hammonds, they were very close through Linda Good Bryant, just above Midtown, both in California at a certain point. Differences that I saw very immediately were that Senga was a mother and that at a certain point she had to care for an older family member, I believe for her mother. And that the timing of like when she had to take a teaching job, or not had to, but she took a teaching job at a university, probably in part because of these different pressures and maybe because she really enjoyed teaching, who knows? But I just didn't see the same sort of choices in these men's lives. And obviously I don't know the specifics of people's lives and I've never deeply talked to Senga about this. So I'm grain of salt, but I just started to think like, oh, you know what, there's more to this story than like, oh, they were making conceptual work or abstraction and people didn't get it. It's like, they especially didn't get it when a woman did it. And they especially didn't get it and didn't allow space for kind of greater expansion of ideas and experimentation, perhaps when you don't feel like you have the possibility to do that because you have 2 children, because you have a sick parent, because you have to have a job that is reliable and stable, because you're the primary caregiver, breadwinner, all these things. There's no one taking care of you except for you. And so this is how I really got into thinking about Black feminism in the context of art history, in the context of kind of the 1970s and conceptual practices. And the reading list, my bibliography for my qualifying exams is a lot of what actually became the source book. Because when Catherine Morris, who is my co-curator, she's still the curator of the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, they were planning the 10th anniversary of that space and wondering, thinking about how to commemorate it, thinking about, it was called the Year of Yes. It was a multi-exhibition, multi-program, kind of huge extravaganza to celebrate that really innovative and singular space. And as a kind of curatorial, like our little brain trust of like the contemporary art department, which was me and Eugenie Tsai, the 2 of us were the department, and Catherine Morris and her team of 2 other people. So this is like 5 people that are actually 2 departments. Started talking informally about what the Sackler Center had done and what it hadn't done, what it still needed to do, where things, things that had been missed, mistakes maybe even that had been made. And the thing that came up so for me immediately and obviously was Black women and Black feminism and womanism, and like the idea that there were other ways of being interested in equity besides, God bless, I love you, Gloria Steinem, but besides Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine and all the kind of tropes that we hear, and that Black women were doing this work and we're having these conversations and we're building these collectives and we don't hear about them. And so that's kind of where the show came from. And when that started popping up, I was like, oh my God, please, please, please. Like I have this amazing bibliography. I have all this stuff. I've read all this stuff. Have you read this? And Catherine at some point was like, should we would you want to do this show together? And I probably leaped at her at the opportunity because it was so in line with, my thinking and with so much of what I was interested in, and the work that I had been doing in graduate school that had, this very particular outlet, which is, your committee of 5 people versus an exhibition and several museums and social media and programs and all the kind of ways in which our academic institutions and our cultural institutions differ in terms of what's possible. So this was the opening of the exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum. And the pairing, I'm not going to go through all the installation images. There are so many, but it's Faith Ringgold's For the Women's House on the left and Maren Hassinger's Leaning in the middle, the sculpture. And I love this because it kind of, for me, is so much the intersection. The show isn't about a certain way of making. It wasn't about painters or people in the Black arts movement or people working in abstraction or in conceptual practices or sculpture or minimalism. it's really, both of these things can be encompassed. These artists with very different aesthetics, with very different kind of approaches, different generations can be included in this historical conversation, and be in dialogue with one another, perhaps in a way that they hadn't been previously. I love this example because one of the other things that's been really important to me about the show, and was really an agenda item, I would say, from the beginning, was creating more opportunity for these artists, many of whom, like Maren Hassinger, had been working for many, many decades, not in obscurity. Certainly, you know, Maren has had great success and is known, but was known in a particular circle. And I don't think had really, considering what she had put in and how many students she has taught over the course of 40 years, had not really, you know, like, what's her pension like? You know, and I think about that sort of thing a lot, is that we laud these artists, but then are they really able to sustain? What does their old age look like? And so we were really thinking about, like, what is one of the great functions and outcomes of a, you know, revisionist history thematic group exhibition, and hope it couldn't be changing the material opportunities and existence of artists of an older generation. So this piece, Leaning, was shown in April Kingsley's Afro-American Abstraction at PS1 in 1981, which is itself a groundbreaking landmark show. And maybe was shown one other time, and then Maren put it into storage. And literally, she had not seen it, had not been out until we saw these sorts of installation images, and we're like, Maren, like, so where's that piece? Like, what's going on with that piece? And she's like, oh, I don't know, I'll go check it out and see how it's doing. Haven't seen it in 30 plus years. And it was restored, it was cleaned, it was installed, it went on the tour to all these different places. And at some point, MoMA bought it. And now it's installed at MoMA in their permanent collection galleries, in dialogue with Joan Semmel and Sengen Ngugi. And for me, it's not like MoMA is the be all end all, but it is that this means a different place for Maren in art history. Whether we are happy or not that kind of MoMA's imprimatur allows for a certain posterity, this is like the world that we currently live in, and I want us to create more spaces by which, like, that kind of imprimatur can be given. But I also, like, I want Maren to have that. I want all these artists to have that. And if that's how you get it right now, like, yes, thank you, MoMA, come and buy the piece. And that would never have happened without the show. And I think that's, like, just one example of the ways. And this piece by Senga had been in MoMA's collection for years. I'd seen it years before, like when I was in graduate school, even before graduate school at MoMA. But for it now to have this context is so important also, both because for the artists individually, but also for art history, that now Senga's work is in dialogue with Maren's work. These people have had such a long relationship as friends and collaborators and peers, but there's also really interesting formal aspects, thinking about materials, thinking about, like, kind of tactic and, like, haptic and body and kinetic, all this stuff. So this also extends the story they're able to tell in really interesting ways. So these are some installation shots. These paintings also, Emma Amos, the Brooklyn Museum now owns one. I believe the Cleveland Museum of Art owns the other one. These we saw at Emma's studio, and literally were like, can we borrow those? They were in her house. Like, and I love this because you have the kind of, this is a self-portrait called Flower Sniffer from 1966, I believe. And then here she quotes herself. Here is the painting again, as a decoration within this later painting of this couple dancing. So this kind of self-reflexivity and this referring back to one's own past practice, I think, is very interesting. These are works. We also had a large section devoted to works on paper, in terms thinking specifically about the Black arts movement, thinking about the kind of utility and the sense of arts utility in general, but also different sort of media and the way in which there's a perception of, like, well, this is good, this can be useful for a broader conversation, a broader struggle, but maybe this cannot. And so I think we were interested in kind of complicating that. But also showing this work. I mean, they're beautiful, incredible, innovative prints. You have works by more by Emma Amos. This is Emma's. Elizabeth Catlett over here, Barbara Jones Hogu, other artists who were part of the Black arts movement. And many of these were in the Brooklyn Museum's collection. Carol Bayard, and Jay Jarrell's incredible wearable art. So I'll just keep going now, I think. So Dinga McCannon was a founding member, along with Faith Ringgold, of Where We At, which is a collective of Black women artists that was founded in, actually, this was their first show, so 1972. And so this is an example of the kind of archival objects that we were able to bring into the exhibition. And so in the installation image, sorry, let me go back. This one, you can see these cases, you can't see into them, but in almost all of the galleries, we had cases like this that had archival imagery of this nature and this nature. This is a photograph of the Where We At group in 1980. Here is Dinga right here. So this is kind of the way we told the story. So both through the artworks by the artists, but also including their own archival images, many of which came from the artists themselves, which is a really amazing, they once we started talking to them, they had so much ephemera that they had kept, so many amazing kind of photos and flyers and just all sorts of things. And of course, not all of them from the show made it into the catalog, sadly, just because of space, but many of them did. I just wanted to share this amazing work by Betty Saar, which this is a work that is kind of connected to the archive in a really interesting way, because we saw a reference to this work in an article or an interview with Betty from 1970 something in the Feminist Art Journal, and we were like, what is this work? Never heard of this work. Never. It's in the kind of Aunt Jemima series, of course, which we're all very familiar with, Aunt Jemima in the Cupboard, but I had never seen this work. And this is such an interesting, this is like a Molotov cocktail. So this is a work we literally saw a reference to, just a title, and went to Betty's gallery, who were in the beginning stages of a kind of catalog raison for Betty. Betty has kept incredible, impeccable records of all of her sales going back to the 1950s. And she was able to find this. Hold on, I have to sneeze. Allergies.
'Tis the season.
Yes, 'tis the season, sorry. Yeah, so her gallery was able to help us track down this work to the person that it had been sold to in the 1970s. And the work had been sold, it actually had been given to, Betty gave it to her lawyer as a trade for services rendered by the lawyer. And so the lawyer was no longer living, but his widow, his wife, lived in New York, in one of the old amazing lofts on Broadway. And we went to her house and she had this piece in her house. And she lent it, we restored it, it was cleaned, and she lent it to the museum for this exhibition. Betty hadn't seen it since 1973. There's no photographs of it anywhere. And in the end, the Brooklyn Museum did buy this piece as well. So now it's in the permanent collection, but we found it through archival research. Like no picture, just a name. And, I think that's kind of the amazing power of the archive. Like it can lead you to things and people and stories that just one tiny reference can take you to this whole thing and this whole new addition to this incredible artist's overall body of work. Here's Senga with Inside Outside. So in this case, this work, the Brooklyn Museum owns this sculpture, but we were also able to show, this is unfortunately kind of a blurry picture, but these images of Senga working, activating the sculpture, because now these sculptures are very fragile and, can't really be touched. Even to install them is to lessen their life, sadly. But we were able to show all these photographs of the way that Senga kind of intended for the work to be engaged with. So we included that in the catalog as well as in the archive. And then we also included things like this, letters. Linda Goodbryant, founder of Just Above Midtown, was incredibly generous with her amazing archive. She has all sorts of things, including, the both kind of mundane to the profound, and things that are both mundane and profound, like this letter from Senga from 1976, Dear Linda, please send more business cards of the gallery. Also, please send any old nylons, pantyhose that you can get from anybody there. This will definitely help the cause. Hope all goes well. Love, Senga. So this kind of, and so at this time, Senga was living in LA and Linda was in New York. And so it's like the sculptures that we see, you know, these ones, and the one that's in MoMA's collection, many of them have been remade, but they were made like in this way, like Linda sending used nylons across the country so that Senga could make these sculptures. And on the right is an LA Times article with notes. I'm assuming Marin, who also was in California at that time, sent this article, you know, in the mail to Linda with this handwritten note: I resent being compared to Betty on the basis of race and sex. It's a way to keep us in our place. This room was not temporary. It was the room offered to me. So she's kind of adding her own parentheticals, you know, critiquing the critic. And I think it's not the idea that her and Betty have nothing to say to each other, but it's the like the laziness, frankly, of like, well, they're both Black, they're both women. Let's talk about them in the same article, even though their exhibitions weren't in the same place. They had nothing to do with each other. They're very different generations, you know, just from the photos, you can tell these are two different people doing two different things. So just that this kind of thing was in the article. So these really personal things, but that are also reflective of a broader kind of conversations we're still having about critics and the state of criticism as it pertains to Black artists and women, Black women specifically. Faith Ringgold protesting at the Whitney, or, you know, now the Frick, until we'll see what else it becomes. But the Breuer building, that is the original home of the Whitney. That's not actually true. It's not the original home of the Whitney, but the Whitney's longest living home. And then Faith on the right in this incredible fur coat, and her daughter, Michelle Wallace, in the middle at an Art Workers Coalition protest. So we also talked a lot about the ways in which, like, we don't hear a lot about Faith Ringgold in relation to the Art Workers Coalition. Like the fact that Faith Ringgold is one of the Judson Three. Like, I took a feminist art history class in undergrad. Like, I studied the Judson Three in my Art of the 1960s class. Nobody told me that Faith Ringgold was one of them, you know? And if Faith was mentioned at all, which she wasn't, to be clear, it would never have been in this context. And so we really wanted to reinsert someone like Faith Ringgold, who has always had her foot in so many different places throughout her career, to really say, like, yes, this like iconic kind of trio at Judson Church, defacing the flag, a Black woman was one of those three people. Like, that's true. That's what happened. And it's Faith Ringgold who continued, perhaps unlike some of those other artists, to protest and agitate and work with incarcerated women and work with different populations of marginalized people and make her paintings. And, you know, like, we just don't hear enough, I think, in the mainstream conversation about like protests in the art world in the 1960s and 70s that includes Black women that are in both their own organizations, but also crossing over into like the quote unquote mainstream organizations. This is another on the left, a different protest against, another protest against the Whitney in the 70s, contemporary Black artists in America, Benny Andrews on the left, and a member of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition. And this for me is interesting because this is like the segue, this was the segue for me to the Whitney when I started working. Actually, I started working at the Whitney in March of 2017, and We Wanted a Revolution opened in April. So I actually like worked at the Whitney for a couple weeks and then went back to Brooklyn to install. But when I was at the Whitney, I had started working on a show called An Incomplete History of Protest, which this work was in. This is in the Whitney's collection, but it is her telling the story of passing out flyers at the Whitney with her daughter and being called a racial epithet for the first time in her life. So the first time that she was called, and yeah, she was at the Whitney. So there's that claim to fame. But for me, this was a very interesting connection because I'd just spent several years researching these protests, looking at these letters, looking at these conversations, and now here I am doing the same thing. This is a work by Emma Amos, which was originally made to be in Heresy's art journal, feminist art journal, which we also included in the show, but also we included it as an exhibition, as an image, as the work, which we were able to find it with Emma, but also the actual reproduction in the issue of the journal. And then finally, this is a photo by Lorna Simpson of the Rodeo Caledonia Collective. This is now in the 1980s. This is Lisa Jones, Kelly Jones's baby sister, Alva Rogers, and other members of the collective. And so Lorna had these incredible photos, like these snapshots, but also, of course, they dressed up. This is a photo shoot. It wasn't just a snapshot in her studio. And we were able to, she was like, oh, well, those aren't artworks. Like, you can't show those. But we showed them as archival. We showed them in a case in kind of a dialogue with Lorna's work that she would make kind of only a couple of years later. And actually around the same time that she was a member of this collective of kind of young, roving, obviously super fly and fabulous young Black woman in Brooklyn. And then this is an incomplete history of protest at the Whitney, just to show you the hate is a sin flag, and its layout with archival material. So I went from Brooklyn and the deep archive to like trolling around in the Whitney's archive and finding things that I was like, why didn't anyone tell me this existed? Because I should have put it into We Want a Revolution, which is always the case. There's always more in the archive. And so I'm gonna stop there and we can chat a little.
So thank you so much, Rue. It's so much occurs to me during your talk because, having been alive and around for a lot of that era, and what you know, it takes a while to see how the story is told. So I think in a way the show is one that could only happen when it happened. Do you know what I mean that way?
Yeah, yeah.
Did you, was a source book always a part of the plan, and how did you decide what went into the source book, and given the amount of, yeah.
Well, I think, a catalog was always a non-negotiable, but as you know, there's always negotiation. And there was a whole thing about not having the budget to do a catalog. And we were basically like, over my dead body, like, we're not, what's the point, but like, we know like that catalogs are a way in which exhibitions are remembered. It just is. And so, and it also is a sign of value and of an institution giving finances in that value in terms of finances, but also in terms of like bandwidth. Just this thing matters, so we made a book basically. So we kind of were like, okay, if we go super crazy and want to do this like amazing glossy book with 1 million reproductions, they're gonna be like, we can't do that. So we were like, what is the most important thing that we can do? What's the most important thing to include? If we were only able to do, and that's kind of where this idea of 2 books came from also, by the way. So we hit upon this idea of a source book, in part because we were coming across so many incredible archival materials, like these incredible, like, not just the content, I'm thinking specifically of, for example, this essay that Toni Morrison wrote in the New York Times Magazine. And it was about like the Black Power movement and feminism, and the layout is amazing. The illustrations are amazing. The ads from the time are amazing. And so the essay I had read before, but I'd read it as a PDF that I like found online. I had never read it. I'd never seen this layout. And our amazing assistant, Ali Rickard, did such incredible research on eBay, bought all these back issues of Ms. and New York Times Magazine and all the different, heresies, Feminist Art Journal, so that we could actually, because we realized at some point that like there's something about the materiality and the actual layouts. And then our graphic design team at the Brooklyn Museum got really excited because, of course, they are like, wow, these layouts are amazing. Like, just like the way this looks is amazing. And so they were real partners in thinking about some, when are we going to reproduce something just as a text, and when are we going to reproduce it as a facsimile? And also make sure it's legible, because of course, like, if it looks cool but no one can read it, this is not really a win. But so yeah, I think we really wanted to preserve and allow people, especially I think in this ongoing age of digitization and the internet and phones, you know, there is something about, it's not just the tactility of paper so much as it is the like period specific nature of particular publications.
Well, and also the visual culture in which all of this was, you know,
Yeah.
landing. It's
Yeah.
great to see those
Yeah.
ads in the Times along
Exactly.
with the...
And it was, and you know, it made it very clear, like when Toni Morrison is writing in the New York Times Magazine, she's writing to a white audience.
Mhm.
And you might kind of know that from the content and the way she's writing, but you really know it, whether Toni herself, you know, to be familiar, Ms. Morrison, whether she herself thought of herself as writing to a white audience, I don't know. And not in general, I mean, specifically for that piece, which she may have, because the readership at that time, she knows who it is. But when you see all the ads and what they're for, you really know. And I think that is really interesting information that like you totally lose by just reading a PDF. So we were thinking about it as a source book in the kind of same way that you, like a course reader for a college course, you know, I had all these course readers, we all do from school. And I was thinking a lot about my art history education and things like that, about faith, not knowing that faith was one of the Judson Three, and basically how do we get this research and this information into the curriculum. And you know, it was like, maybe just make a book that's like affordably priced. I think it was $24.99. We really didn't, we wanted it to not be expensive, and that's already perfect. It's like, oh, you're a professor who has an idea that some stuff is kind of missing, but you're not really sure. And it is a lot of work to change your syllabus and write a new syllabus. And maybe it's not your area of expertise. And, you know, academia makes you feel like you can't talk about anything that's not your area of expertise. It's like, here's this book, just like assign a couple of readings to your students.
It's
and that has happened.
That
has happened. I mean, it's been really amazing to see that happen. And it's really amazing to hear from students, like randomly, who are like, oh, my professor assigned, you know, we bought that book for our class. Like my professor like assigned XYZ readings from it. And that was the point of why we did it that way. But we still wanted to have the kind of new essays. We wanted to have, you know, the glossy pictures. We wanted to have a complete checklist. Also knowing how, the thing that I often am like yearning for about exhibitions from the past is to know, like, well, what was in the show? Right. Checklist.
Right.
So the second book, which was done, it came out at the end of the show. We were able to have, and you never see the perfect, you know, you're like, what did it look like? There's no installation images. Because if you do a book for the beginning of the show, you can't include, because your deadlines were like 6 months ago. So yeah, we were able to then do the second book that had like an amazing essay by Kelly Jones about Elizabeth Catlett and new research that Kelly had done, another essay by Lisa Jones, and just, you know, new scholarship for that book, as opposed to reproducing previous essays and writings, as well as installation images, as well as a complete checklist. So I my vision, they would exist as a box set, but no one, that never happened. You know, I had to give up the box set idea, but you can make your own box at home.
Right. I was saying it's happening de facto. I want to circle back to the impact on the way art history is taught in a minute, but we have a couple of questions from the audience. Charlene asked, did you think about other ways of showing the archival documents? Was the glass case the only option?
Well, I'm going to say no, because how can one thing always be the only option?
Right.
But I think in the kind of constraints of a museum exhibition with kind of very precious things, like, you know, we thought of like, oh, should we like have an issue for people to look through? But like over the course of 6 months and the show's traveling to 3 venues, like that object is going to be just like rubbed to smithereens. So, you know, that, and, you know, I think it's also like people, especially art people, especially art museum people, I think maybe less so now, are often hesitant to include archival material at all, because it's not art, and it's context, and it's not like, people don't, you know, I think this idea of like, oh, people don't want to read all that stuff, and like, you know, I was like, I do, and I have to assume like if I do, other people do. And so the glass cases, I think, were a way to have it be kind of aesthetic in some way, that there still is, it's not like it looks nice, you know, that's part of it. That's part of installing a show. But also it's accessible so that it's legible, people could see it, and it's not too overwhelming. Like we couldn't, that's why not everything that's in the source book is in the exhibition. We cut things to make it kind of a little tighter, because I do think while people do want to see it and people do want to read, it can be a lot. It was a really big show. And like, if you're like reading like 500 pages in every gallery, that's like a little fatiguing. But yeah, I mean, I think there's probably other ways of, I mean, I think you could do them on an iPad. I really didn't want to do it on an iPad just because I wanted people to see like we installed the actual magazines in the cases. And I wanted people to see not just the layouts, but see like, you know, like the thing, even if they can't touch it. So I guess, yeah, like iPads, and there's definitely like other kind of digital solutions, but I was very invested in like, how do we show people the thing?
We have another question from Deborah. Hi, sociologists of race here. Thank you so much for grounding art in what we in sociology call the socio-historical context of the work. How can social scientists like myself draw on, and complement archival and creative work? Good question.
Well, that is a good question. I mean, I think, and this could be totally wrong or just my own perception, I think that the kind of art creative work side is more, not always, but if you're interested in that way of thinking about art history, like a social art history, I think there's a much greater facility and desire to pull things in from different disciplines. I don't always necessarily feel that it goes the other way. I think art is sometimes used in kind of historical studies or sociological studies in a very illustrative way. It's like, here's an example or something, and it's not really like interpreted or discussed in its own, as its own object and its own right, as it's with its own kind of discourse. Whether that be an art historical discourse, a formal discourse, like a medium specific, whatever it is, and a social discourse, you know, that all of those things are working together. So I kind of, that's like, sometimes this is I'm like answering a different question, but sometimes I find that a little bit frustrating, that art is sometimes used as like, is an illustration of somebody's idea, like, which of course I'm like, well, the artist didn't make it. They don't even know you. They don't know your idea. Like, this was 40 years ago. And so I think, yeah, it's like, I think specificity is very important. And so the kind of question of being specific about what an artwork is doing and why it's helpful to this XYZ conversation that's being had in a different discipline, that's maybe related, but is out, there's no one-to-one. I think being very specific, and really thinking about the art, actually, not just the concept that's being that's trying to be illustrated, is really important.
Yeah, I'm encouraged about the increased sort of interdisciplinary conversations that are happening now. But it does seem like a lot of it is happening on the art history side. But maybe because I know less about the sociological side. So Deborah, if you want to follow up on that, we'll please do comment. I was it connects though with, the increased focus on historiography within art history, that's not tied to, periodization necessarily. It's a more sort of encompassing approach that includes, research methods. And I was wondering how much a part of your training that was, and if that's where the germ of this happened, because you were interested in artistic movements that had preceded your, coming into professional life. I was wondering what your engagement with the material was in your training, and what you see as the future of that for people who are want to do curatorial work.
I mean, I think I have just always been interested in like old stuff. What like stuff, you know, I don't know. I've just always been very interested in like reading, you know, I don't know. It's just always been interesting to me. And I think going to graduate school in many ways was very hard and like alienating, as I think, you know, many people have that experience. But something that it really did do for me was give me, of course, access to this incredible library, and, you know, the UC Systems library, which is immense, not just my individual university. And of course, you know, time to look at stuff. And so I don't know so much that it's like about a certain training. You know, I think you have to be curious in the way that research, especially archival research, requires, which is that you have to do the thing of like, oh, well, I read this one thing and then it led me to this other thing and it led me to this other thing. And I, instead of being like, ugh, that's not what I'm looking for, you have to be kind of excited by that kind of, those kind of serendipitous, unexpected, you know, path that you're on. And I think I didn't really know where it was going. You know, I didn't really know what I was doing at all, frankly, but I knew that it was really interesting to me and that I wanted to hear more, and I wanted to read more. And, you know, a lot of it started with Just Above Midtown and with Linda, and, you know, coming across, you know, I went to a program at MoMA that Linda did with earthworms, where she had everybody in the audience. I mean, yeah, maybe you were there, everyone in the audience. I know Lowry was there, with their little boxes of earth and earthworms in like the auditorium at MoMA. And this is when I was in graduate school. And so I knew like a little bit about Just Above Midtown, but not very much. And I was just like, what's happening right now? Like, who is this person and what is she doing? And like, who got MoMA to say okay to having earthworms and dirt in their auditorium? Because I'm 100% sure they did not want to do that. So I don't know. I think I would say like curiosity is kind of the most, that is what I think of as is my greatest asset in the kind of research and the archival based work that I've done. Is that I am genuinely interested and curious and want to read more and want to see more and want to learn more and want to connect more of the dots around. Yeah, especially I think there's like a nostalgia, or I feel a nostalgia for that kind of moment in the art world when I think it was maybe a smaller art world. But also in some ways a more expansive art world and a more, you know, the expectation of like making a life out of it is very different now. But of course I'm also like, and thank God, like people should be able to make a living as artists and make a life out of it. So I know I totally romanticize it because I wasn't there. And so, you know, and I also have really always been interested in kind of intergenerational dialogue. I've always been interested in, you know, like I was the child of my cousins who was like excited to go hear my grandfather's like genealogical story and like go through the whole family tree, because he was very into that sort of thing, go through the whole family tree with him and go to the graveyard where XYZ aunt was buried and like do like we would do like grave robber. Like I was super into that. I was like a child who thought that was so interesting and like was like my dream day to spend with my grandfather. So you know, I don't know. Those are not the same thing, but I think there's like a thread of like interest in the past and interest in the material record of the past, whether that be the deep past or the more recent past.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that material record, we've been talking about how well, you talked at the beginning of your talk about the importance of language, you know, Black men and women of color, and that goes to the you know, finding aids in archives as well, and how difficult things can be to surface entirely because of language. Did you encounter any of that? And then we have a follow-up from Deborah.
Like encounter difficulty in terms of
finding, locating. Did you know what was in the Brooklyn Museum collection to begin with, for example, or
in terms of the artworks? Or
the archives?
Well, the Brooklyn Museum, the archives in terms of we didn't really find that much in the Brooklyn Museum's archives. We found a couple of things relating to like the community gallery that they had in the 1970s, around the same time that the Whitney did the Contemporary Black Artists in America, or right around the time of Harlem on My Mind, all of this happening at all the institutions around the same time. But yeah, I mean, when I came to the Whitney, I was like, oh, not some institutions keep really good records. And that is also a feature of a certain privilege and a certain sort of like infrastructure that other, especially kind of outer borough, whatever you want to call all of our sister institutions, you know, don't have that kind of same sort of luxury, even of building a collection. It's a different experience in relationship to building a collection. So we didn't, I mean, the Brooklyn Museum got this incredible collection of Black arts movement related works in around, I think, 2011, which included a lot of screen prints, works on paper, which a lot of which we showed. So that kind of print wall that I showed, a lot of that was Brooklyn Museum collection. The wearable suits by J. Earle were the Brooklyn Museum's as well. And so the Brooklyn Museum had been collecting in this arena of the Black arts movement. So that was a part of, and it had, you know, the Brooklyn Museum had the incredible kind of self-portrait by Faith Ringgold. There were particular works, the Sengen and Goody works. There were particular works that did anchor and allowed us to kind of build out the rest of the show. But there were, I mean, a ton of loans also. But yeah, I mean, I think it's like the kind of research that's like archival research, like reading kind of research. And then there's the kind of research that's like object, like finding this artwork and like who owns it and who do you send the loan to and where was it shown last, and like it's like detective work in a certain way that is, you know, like archival research could be very lonely and you're just like, oh, I read this thing and then I read this thing and I read this thing and I was alone the whole time. Whereas the art, at some point, you know, you have to call, you know, you're on the phone with like cold calling people and like galleries which may have closed, and the person who ran it is now like 85 years old and nothing is digitized because computers didn't exist and there was no internet. And, you know, so I think it's like you have to, you don't always know what you're looking for. And I know that there's absolutely artists, objects, archival objects that are not in the show because we didn't find out about them, you know, because we didn't hear about them or we heard about them too late. So I definitely always say that this show and any show is not comprehensive. And hopefully it's, you know, what I would love for there to be, every single one of those artists deserves their own kind of monographic exhibition and catalog and someone to do the real catalog raisonné deep dive on them. But this is like an initial kind of opening thing to give people like, you know, ideas, hopefully.
We have a question from Tori. As you spend time with artists and in the archives, have oral histories shaped your research?
Yes, I love an oral history. The Archives for American Art is such an incredible resource and organization. So many of their oral histories are on their website, actually. And so you can either read a transcript or actually listen to the original. And you know, there was an amazing one that Emma Amos did, I think in the 1980s. She'd actually done a couple at different points in her career, which is so interesting. You know, I was so happy to be asked to do an oral history with Linda Goodbryant for Bomb Magazine for their African-American archival history project. So I did, you know, we had like 3 2-hour-long conversations for what was supposed to be like, you know, a 5-page thing and turned into like a massive epic. You know, Camille Billups is someone that I want to shout out. Jim Hatch and Camille Billups, the Hatch Billups Archive, such an incredible resource, both for material culture, but also for oral histories. When we, you know, one of the most amazing experiences out of the many, many amazing experiences that we had on working on this show was going to their loft, also their old school Soho Broadway loft, which I'm sure you've been to, Linda. In the last years of their lives. They both passed within 2 to 5 years after that. But they came to see the show. Camille came to see the show, which is something we included her films as well as images of her screen printing and works on paper, as well as examples of their magazine, their publication that they made. But one of the things that Camille gave me, and like under pain of death, not to lose it. I mean, she's like such a no joke person.
Yeah.
Like I was like, whoa, and this is you like in your 70s, like you're so intense.
Yeah.
So intense and amazing. But she gave us a cassette tape of a roundtable town hall kind of conversation that happened at Artist Space around the Nigger Drawings exhibition. Yeah. Which I'm sure, you know, Lowry, I know, was involved with that. But she gave us this cassette tape that was that she just had, like, you know, I'd had a conversation with her assistant, and their house was, it was like floor to ceiling full of stuff. And somehow she had found this cassette tape recording, which, like, I mean, I was like, what's happening right now? Like, so, and that's an oral history. I mean, that's a different kind of oral history, but what we did is we showed the cassette, like, again, this idea of the object in the gallery in a case, but we then digitized it and had headphones so you could listen to it. And then we included some of the transcript in the catalog, I believe. But, you know, it's been referenced, like Jeff Chang referenced that recording in his book, Who We Be, which is how I learned about it. Speaking of the way research leads you to research, because I saw like a footnote about this recording that Camille had let him listen to, like in her house, but she wouldn't let him take it with her. And so then I was like, well, I told Jeff and I was like, well, what is this? You know, like, do you have any notes? And he sent me his notes. And he's like, that's all that's all. She wouldn't let me take it. She wouldn't let me tape it. Like, I just literally was listening to it, like with her, like staring me down and like trying to like type this fast. Yeah. And then I like had to get out, you know, she was like, okay, you can go now. So that's how we even came to know about it. So yeah, oral histories were very important. And the oral histories of conversation, like just even that experience with Camille, we went to their house, we were there for 4 hours, like didn't have a glass of water, didn't go to the bathroom, didn't sit down. Like she just talked, they talked for 4 straight hours, these two people in their 80s. So I'm like, what am I doing? I need to sit down. She doesn't need to sit down. So let me like find some energy.
Two amazing people who we lost in the last year, and who had the foresight to give the archives to the Emory, so they are being taken care of. There are shout outs to the Hatch Phillips collection in the chat. We have a question from Marcus Brooks. Do you have any advice or insight for non-art historians, sociologists here as well, who do archival work on how to write about historical documents and people while dealing with the tension of us surveilling histories of people we don't know, specifically on uncovering and telling narratives of marginalized historical figures?
Okay, wait, I'm gonna read. I'm like not good at list. I'm like better at reading than listening.
Okay,
so I'm just gonna read it really fast for myself. I got lost.
That's probably
no, it's 100% me. This is like an ongoing problem. I'm like, can I see it? I can't like listen. I need to see it. Yeah, this is like always a tension, and I think that example of actually the Hatch Phillips experience, our visit, and Camille having such a strong sense and a strong and tight hold over the material that she held, that she had collected over the course of 50 years, and just the example of like of Jeff Chang being able to listen to it but not take it, and for whatever reason, like he's a nice guy, like but for her, like, I don't know you. And for whatever reason that she felt differently a couple years later, or maybe more people are asking, or maybe she just was like, well, you seem nice. I mean, I don't know, any possible number of reasons. Like, you're a young Black woman, like, go ahead. Yes, like you can have it. But not that she was like especially like fuzzy about it. It's just like, if you don't bring this back to me, it's like, oh, we're gonna bring it back. Promise.
She would have talked about you too, all over the place.
Oh my God, I already knew. Yes, I already knew. I was like, do not worry, I will not mess anything up. But I think that that's an example though of like, there's like an ethical responsibility to kind of going into the archive, I think, and of to your point, to the questioner's point, Marcus, so like telling stories and surveilling the past, especially when people are no longer there to speak for themselves. I mean, I think in this case, well, no, there is a real, you know what, here isn't a good example. Alva Rogers, who is a part of the Rodeo Caledonia collective, and who is still a theater maker and creative person in New York, her papers all went, she had recently given them to the Fales Library at NYU, which is another archive that we used actually that I didn't mention. Amazing archive, amazing librarians. And her papers, she had just sent, and when I say papers, obviously it's like actually boxes and boxes of stuff, some of which is papers, other of which is objects, and it hadn't been cataloged yet. So the only way to know what was in this archive, which was in the process, or, you know, when they got the next kind of round of budget from the university, then they would start archiving, you know, whatever the process is, and cataloging it so that you could search and know what was actually in the boxes. So they let me very kindly just come in and like look through the boxes because I had Alva's permission, you know, like I had to come, and Alva called and she was like, it's fine. But there was things in there, you know, I don't know what the experience is of like giving your papers to an archive, and I cannot imagine that you go through every single thing. Maybe some people do, but that you go through every single thing and are like, well, is this something that I want the future to see or not? You know, like, and that decision is often left then up to the librarians and then to researchers. And there were things, you know, like cards from her ex-husband, journals, you know, her personal journals talking about, her relationship or her, you know, things in her life. There were audio recordings that she had made with her friends at the time. So at their very, you know, in their mid-20s, before children, before partners, before kind of the version of them that we all now know, and people that are all out and about in the art world, that people that I know now, but of course I didn't know them then. And I'm listening to this audio interview of them, you know, just chatting with their girlfriend about some guy they're seeing, or their visions for the future, or their aspirations for the future. And I know that like, oh, their life didn't turn out that way. Not in a bad way, but like, oh, they never had a child, or they never had like the big like family wedding that they said their mother was so invested in, or they did become, you know, this incredible, world-renowned artist, you know, but then like a couple of years later, it changed, and, you know, they did publish the incredible book and get all this attention and really achieve, but like 20 years later, they haven't published another book, and just all this stuff where I was like, that's like not what this is about. Like, I am not comfortable making the decision to put that into public space. Like, it's not my decision to make. And if I felt like there was something that was really important that advanced the exhibition, I would have gone to Alva and asked her. But at a certain point, I was like, I don't even need to like, I've looked through like 2 boxes out of 5. It's a lot of personal stuff. It doesn't really connect back to Rodeo Caledonia. It doesn't really connect back to this exhibition. So I'm going to stop now, because now I'm just like really deep in this person's life in a way that they don't even maybe know, because I don't know whether she went through every box and knows every single item that's in there. And so for me, it was like, this is starting to feel unethical on a couple of different levels. So I'm going to stop. But
No, I'm just thinking, as you say that, how difficult that's going to be now that part of someone's archives, all of our archival footprints are in social media as well, and the issue of privacy. So that has great implications, right?
It's interesting because on the one hand, it's almost like the loss of this question, because there doesn't really exist the same, like people, the version of yourself and the way you present yourself on social media is not the same as how you might present yourself in your journal to yourself, which you don't expect anyone to read. But then 20 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, it's in an archive. I don't know what is going to go in the archive of like, is it, I really don't know. And I'm like always asking librarians this. I'm sure they think it's like both like the only question anyone ever asks them. Okay, guys, if you're so worried about it, like write a letter, I guess. But
No.
yeah.
We have, you might want to read this. It's a long question, but a really interesting one from Mark. Much respect, Rujeko. And you can read it for yourself, Rue, and I'll read it out loud. There's part of a Toni Morrison's Mouthful of Blood, where she talks about James Baldwin and Chinua Achebe and herself all fighting against imitating the English language and making it bear the burden of the Black experience. Within that, and per your work, Morrison has the double, triple, quadruple work of making the language bear the experience of Black women. Within Black women, within that, I guess, what of language gets seen, who decides, why, and let's see, and to make the leap, if you will, archived, because it is the English language, after all, as long as it perpetuates English and not language. Long way around asking the implicit revolutionary nature of this work. Your work is to expose the necessity / the hegemony and the decisions made as it pertains to what gets archived, and particularly within the Black du jour modality of certainly museums, but the language aesthetic of art writ large. So I guess the question is about how do you not replicate the system in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of English and the hegemony of the English language is a really important one. I am sadly only an English speaker, but also I'm deeply privileged to be only an English speaker, because that is the language, thanks to colonialism, of most of our, world in some capacities. And I'm thinking about this question a lot. Catherine Morris went to Brazil for the Sao Paulo Biennale at some point after we had done We Want a Revolution, and she did a presentation about the show in Brazil to a Brazilian audience. And it was really interesting to hear her kind of reflecting back on how the audience there responded, and then on the kind of questions she got and the conversations that she had afterwards. But she sent me this picture while she was there of a young woman she ran into at the bathroom line, who was like, in her early 20s, like younger than me, younger than all of us. And she was wearing a We Wanted a Revolution t-shirt that she said like someone had brought her from Brooklyn or something like that. And the like identification that she felt very deeply with, just this idea of Black radical women, and like she only spoke Portuguese, but she, unlike us English speakers, spoke enough English for Black radical women to be resonant for her. But I do think a lot about that, like this conversation, there's so much out there that's not in English, that hasn't been translated, that's not in our archives. And aside from that, even the idea of an archive, just like the idea of a museum, is a colonial idea, and though I believe deeply in the preservation of these things so that we can shift the way that these systems work, with it, we are not just born, we are all, everyone alive almost without exception is living on the planet is living under a colonial rubric, not a post-colonial rubric, a colonial rubric. And so I think that's not like to be fatalistic, that's just the truth. And so I think even when I work at a museum, I've worked at multiple museums, the history of museums is colonialism, not just in terms of extraction of objects from the countries of their origin, but just the idea even of a collection in someone's home that's for private viewing, and for scholarship and study. And of course, there's many, many types of scholarship. The question of oral histories gets to that. Oral cultures, oral histories, different ways of passing down knowledge. And, I think that is a really interesting challenge to think about. What are the other ways we can disseminate information, and other ways we can share the past that don't have to rely only on these kind of colonially informed structures?
You know,
And
I think
this is like the question of all of our lives, because we literally live in it.
exactly. We're swimming in it. And in a way, I think some of these issues you bring up, you know, inform a certain reluctance of Black people to participate in archives in a way, or, you know, Camille amassed this archive, but was very careful about it. She understood its vulnerability as a body of knowledge, I guess, and the hostility around what it represents. And I wondered if you encountered any resistance from artists or in collecting some of the work that relates back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely had to build a lot of trust. And that is, you know, I don't think that's a really important part of doing an exhibition like this, especially with artists who are either older, who are no longer living, or who are, you know, in the time that we worked on this show, or in the couple of years after. Yeah, Camille passed, Emma Amos passed, you know, there are other artists, who am I thinking of right now? Blondell Cummings passed many, many years ago. And, you know, her family is like is whatever kind of estate or trust she has, you know, they live in Brooklyn, and it's like her nephew, who is such a lovely person, but was also like, what do you want? Like, who are you? You know, and so feeling because Blondell left very specific instructions about, like, she doesn't want her work to be reperformed. She was a choreographer and a dancer. And so there's very few existing recordings of her performing. She doesn't want other people to perform them. And they now have to kind of make this decision about, like, well, do we honor that forever, and then know that, like, our family members' legacy and the important work that she did may kind of not be remembered in the same way, because dance kind of does perpetuate by, you know, when you think of like Balanchine or other choreographers that are maybe more well known in ballet more than perhaps modern dance, it's through the performance of these works. So, you know, I think we definitely, you know, like Elizabeth Catlett's family, her sons and grandchildren, you know, we definitely had to kind of, you know, people are really like, are you for real? Like, are you going to come back? Are you going to keep talking to me? Is this like just a random phone call and I'm never going to hear from you again? Or are you going to get the artwork and I'm never going to hear from you again? You know, collectors who own really amazing works of art that they've had for a very long time and nobody cared about them, and now museums are like, oh, like, you have this amazing sculpture by Elizabeth Catlett, like, can we borrow it? And they're like, well, who are you? You know, and so I mean, I think, I wouldn't say that we encountered resistance, but we encountered healthy and deserved skepticism, you know, based on the kind of historical experience that Black artists and kind of people who are devoted to Black artists have experienced. So, but again, very like everybody, I don't think there's anyone who was like, I don't want to be Adrian Piper. But we didn't ask her to be in the show. Not because you know, what we did was we included letters that she had written to Linda Goodbryant, which we found in Linda's Just Above Midtown archives. We included those letters in a case, not because, like, I 100% respect her and any artist's decision about where they feel their work is best situated and discussed, but I also was like, you are a part of this historical record. You were around Just Above Midtown. Like, these people were your peers. You were in dialogue with them, and like, I have all these letters, like, I'm not making it up. So, you know, but I think that's an example. Like, I didn't even try. I was like, I know how you feel. Like, you've said it multiple times. I don't, and that's a similar thing to the archive, like with Alva's papers. Like, why am I going to go and try to act like I know more than you about your work and where you think your work should be positioned and how it should be discussed? Like, you're the authority and you've said it very clearly. So I'm going to respect that.
And by the way, there's a program on some of Blondell's archival material that the GRI is doing.
I know.
Yeah, so
I
was curious about that for the same reasons you mentioned, and looking forward to it.
I'm very excited about that. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one other question, or if anyone has one. If not, I will, there's a lot in the chat about how this conversation with you was sparking ideas. And Simone's here, yes, and she's the one who let me know about the Blondell Cummings exhibition, and we will send out that. I think only the panelists can see the link, Simone. So we'll send it out. And thank you for letting us know about that. I will sort of ask one question, you know, the sort of standard, what's next question for you?
Well, yeah, Julie Meritu's show is up right now,
Yeah.
which is amazing.
Yeah.
It'll be up until the beginning of August.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, we are taking Jennifer Packer's exhibition from the Serpentine Gallery in London is going to travel to the Whitney in October, and I'm working on that.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
Wow.
very excited.